Hello, and welcome to our third week on the theme of embracing change for Awakened. One of the most catastrophic events that we read about in the Hebrew Bible is the Babylonian exile. The Babylonians came into Jerusalem and they sacked the city, but more than that, they destroyed the temple. Now, this was incredibly significant because the temple wasn't just the place where everybody worshiped. It was the holiest place on earth for the ancient Israelites. And they believed that in the innermost sanctum, in the Holy of Holies, God literally lived there. That God was literally in there. They, of course, believed that God was everywhere, but they specifically thought that God was there in the center of the temple in the Holy of Holies. And the way this worked was you would go into this big, beautiful temple, and each layer of the temple was a little bit more sacred, and there were more requirements about who could go in until you got to this innermost sanctum. And the only person who went in there was the high priest, who only went in there on the Day of Atonement, one day a year. And so it was sacred. And whenever the temple was destroyed, it felt very much like their God had been defeated. The Babylonians didn't stop there, though. They also took the leaders out of the country and took them back to Babylon for several decades. You can understand how heart-wrenching this must have been, how much despair there must have been in the midst of all of this. And it is in this context that the book of Lamentations was written. The book of Lamentations is about this fear and this despair that people feel in the midst of the exile and afterwards. And yet, in the book of Lamentations, despite all of this loss, all of this fear, all of the separation and the desire and the longing to be back in the homeland, there is a sense of hope and a recognition that God is with God's people, even though they felt like their God had been defeated, that God was still with them. And that's actually really powerful, because as you read through the book of Lamentations in the midst of all the sorrow, the recognition that God is still with them, that's powerful. I think in the midst of difficult times, it can often be harder to feel God's presence. We wonder where God is and how we can know that God is with us. And yet, the promise that we find over and over again in the Bible, especially in books like Lamentation, is that God is with us. That God has never promised that life is going to be easy, but God has promised to be with us every step of the way, perhaps especially when things are difficult. And if we allow ourselves to embrace that idea that God is with us at all times and through all things, especially in the midst of difficulty, that can bolster us up, especially whenever we're feeling low or when things aren't going our way. We don't expect God to fix it or to come in and magically make everything right, but instead, it's a knowledge that even if we feel abandoned by everybody else, that God is with us, and that we are still connected to this great divine mystery. And for me at least, that's something that I find incredibly inspiring, especially in the difficult times. During this section, we're talking about embracing change. And change can be really good. Change can also be really hard, really difficult. And not all change is good. And yet, recognizing that no matter what kind of change we are going through in our lives, God is with us is powerful, because it can help us get through that change, whether it's bad change or good change, or even good change that is still really, really hard, that God is with us. Embracing change. This week's spiritual practice is to read a new book of the Bible. We're trying new things as we are embracing change. And so this week's spiritual practice is to try and read a new book of the Bible, or if you've read them all, to read one with which you are less familiar. If you've read all the books in the Bible and you're familiar with them all, maybe reading a non-canonical biblical text, like say the Gospel of Thomas or one of the other Gnostic Gospels, perhaps that is something new that you could read that might give you new insights. And as you read, ask questions about the text. What's the author's concern? What is their emotional state? What is their experience? What are they writing about? And try to get a little bit of insight into the author's perspective. And then think about what that has to say for you. If you haven't read the book of Lamentations, or you haven't read it recently, or you're not real familiar with it, perhaps the book of Lamentations is a good place to start, recognizing that even in the midst of difficulty, these folks found God's presence right there. Whatever book you choose to read, I hope it's meaningful for you and gives you some insight into God's presence in your life. May it be so. Amen.